Can you believe this tweet from Nick Huber? I hold my boys back in school so they are the oldest in their classes. Massive advantage over the kids of parents who blindly follow the rule. They'll be bigger, more mature, better at relationships, get the girls, on and on. That confidence will lead to massive success. Alright, let's play. Should we keep this in the bank or should we toss that shit in the toilet? If you want to improve your life and you think these videos are very informative and they're very funny, watch my other videos. I got a ton of them backlogged. And if you like it, subscribe. Alright, back to the video. This tweet immediately grabs your attention because it's there. It's bold. Right away, it makes a claim that sounds pretty logical and not crazy. The idea that holding your kids back in school, intentionally making them the oldest in their class, gives them an advantage isn't wild. It's deliberate. There's a system behind it, and anyone who thought about early development or child strategy can see the logic. On paper, it reads like a calculated move rather than a reckless opinion. That's why it feels believable even if it's controversial. I also get why parents would think this gives their child an edge. Would you like when you look at the kids in any classroom, you notice pattern. The oldest kids often appear bigger, stronger, and more confident. They are physically ahead in growth spurts, socially ahead in terms of maturity, and sometimes even academically ahead because they've had that extra year to develop. Parents see that and naturally wonder, can this be leveraged intentionally? Is there a way to give my child the kind of early confidence that might set them up for better outcomes later in life? That's the perspective behind this tweet. It's not malicious or weird. They're thinking it's strategic. The argument that being the oldest can come with advantages has some truth to it. Development isn't uniform. A kid who is a year older than their peers can have a noticeable difference in height, coordination, or emotional regulation. Even small differences in maturity can impact social dynamics. In a classroom, this can translate to being more assertive, participating more confidently, or even forming stronger relationships or friendships. Teachers may notice, other kids notice, and these early wins feed a child's sense of capability. So yes, being older in a classroom often gives certain advantages that aren't just about knowledge or academics. Size, maturity, and confidence do matter, especially early on. There's something tangible about being bigger, faster, or more socially poised in elementary or middle school. Kids are learning to navigate friendships, group activities, and the basics of social influence. A little extra size or maturity can make challenges easier, reduce social friction, and give the child more space to grow comfortably. Confidence builds on itself. If a kid feels capable, they are more likely to take risks, explore new interests, and push themselves academically and socially. From that perspective, the tweet's logic makes intuitive sense. The early edge might lead to early confidence, and early confidence often opens door. But here's the catch. This logic skips something important. It phrases advantages purely as a function of age, size, and social dominance within a classroom, and that's only part of the picture. Confidence and competence aren't guaranteed by being the oldest. Emotional intelligence, resilience, creativity, and adaptability matter just as much, if not more, in the long term. A kid who's slightly younger but forced to navigate challenges, handle frustration, or develop problem-solving skills might gain deeper resilience than the older kid who is always slightly ahead. The tweet itself treats success as a linear equation. Older equals better. Bigger equals more capable. Early even equals easier. But human development, social growth, and long-term achievements are far more nuanced than that. Another thing to consider is context. Being older might matter more in the early grades, but those advantages often fade over time. By high school or college, the differences in size or early maturity are usually negligible. Social dynamics evolve, and confidence isn't just inherited from age. It comes from repeating experiences of competence and risk-taking. There's also a risk of overconfidence or entitlement. A kid who's always the oldest may never learn the subtle skills of adapting to peers who are different, competing with equals, or handling situations where they aren't naturally ahead. Early advantage without deliberate guidance can sometimes backfire, creating gaps in coping skills that matter later. What's interesting about the tweet is how it emphasizes a parent's control. It assumes the parent can engineer success by manipulating age and exposure to peers. That strategy makes sense on one level. Parents can influence many factors, but it also assumes that the world will always reward early dominance. Life rarely works that way. Many of the qualities that lead to long-term success, resilience, creativity, empathy, curiosity, develop in ways parents can't always control. You can give your kids size, confidence, or a head start in class, but you can't fully dictate how they respond to challenges, setbacks, or unfamiliar social environments. So when you read this tweet, the immediate reaction is mixed. On one hand, it's a sharp, strategic perspective. It acknowledges patterns in child development that are easy to observe. On the other hand, it's oversimplified. It assumes that early advantage equals long-term dominance, ignoring the subtleties of personal growth, adaptation, and experience. And that's important to recognize because if you take only half the logic seriously, you might overestimate the payoff of early advantage and underestimate the need for deliberate emotional, social, and cognitive development. In the end, this tweet succeeds because it sparks thoughts. It pushes parents or anyone thinking about growth to question how early experiences shape confidence, social skills, and success, but it also leaves space for nuance. Being the oldest isn't the only path to advantage, and early confidence isn't guarantee of long life success. It's one factor among many, and like most factors, it interacts with countless other elements that the tweet doesn't explore. So yeah, the strategy is clear, the logic understandable, and it's tempting to agree with parts of it, but it's equally important to step back and see the bigger picture. That success is rarely linear, developing isn't uniform, and confidence doesn't come from a single variable. The tweet gets people thinking, which is exactly why it spreads, because it's provocative, relatable, and sparks debate, and acknowledges both sides in the most honest reaction we can have. And if we really try to look deep into this tweet isn't really even about school. School is just a surface level topic. What it's really revealing is how the person thinks confidence and success are built, because there are a few assumptions baked into this that most people don't even notice. They just feel it's true. The first one is that confidence comes from comparison. The idea is if my kid's bigger, older, more mature than the kids around them, they'll feel confident. They'll win more, they'll stand out, and that feeling of being ahead will stick with them. And honestly, in the beginning, that's not wrong. Being ahead of the people around you does feel good. It's easier to speak up when you're the tallest kid in the room. It's easier to lead when things come more natural to you. But the problem is that kind of confidence only works as long as the comparison works in your favor. The moment your environment changes, new school, new peers, new expectations, the confidence gets tested. If your belief in yourself is built on being ahead of others, it gets shaky when you're suddenly not. The second assumption is that being ahead early means you'll stay ahead later. This one feels obvious. Start strong, stay strong. Early wins build momentum. If you give a kid a head start, they'll carry it forward. But real life doesn't work that cleanly. A lot of early advantages fade. Size evens out. Maturity level evens out. Social dynamics change. The kid who was dominant at 8 might be average at 16. The kid who struggled early might explode later. Being ahead early doesn't guarantee anything long term. It just means you were ahead then. Another thing in this tweet that you're probably not thinking is the idea that school is some permanent hierarchy. Like there's a top, a middle, a bottom, and if you can place your kid near the top early, set their position. But school isn't a fixed ladder. It resets constantly. New classmates, new skills, new rules, new social system. Early stage, reshuffle the deck. If you treat school like a permanent ranking system, you start optimizing for staying on top instead of learning how to handle change. And handling change is that skill that actually matters later. And then there's this belief that rules are the main thing holding kids back. This tweet frames it like parents who follow the system are limiting their kids, and the smart move is to bend or break the rules to get an edge. Most of the time, rules aren't the bottleneck. Two kids in the same grade can end up in completely different places depending on how they're supported, challenged, and guided. Age placement matters way less than how a kid learns to deal with pressure, failure, and uncertainty. Breaking the rules doesn't automatically create confidence. Sometimes it just postpones the hard lessons and the biggest assumptions of all, how success is being defined. The tweet frames success as dominance, being bigger, being more confident, gaining attention, winning socially, being ahead of the group. That kind of success looks great early on, but later in life, the people who do the best usually aren't the ones who are dominating early. They're the ones who adapted when things change, new environments, new expectations, new levels of competition. Dominance works when the game stays the same. Life doesn't. None of this means the tweet's stupid or evil. It just means it's incomplete. It focuses on one path to confidence and ignores the other. It overvalues early advantage and undervalues adaptability. Here's usually a part that gets skipped when thinking about conversations like this. Real life has a way of finding early advantages way faster than people expect. They're not slow, not over decades. Sometimes it's just a few years. You see it all the time if you've been around school, sports, friends groups, or even workplace long enough. The kid who was clearly ahead at 8 doesn't stay clearly ahead forever. Sometimes they're still doing fine, but the gap shrinks, and sometimes it disappears completely. Early advantages feel permanent because they're visible. You can see size, you can see confidence, you can see who speaks first, who leads a group, who gets attention, but what's visible early isn't always what matters later. One of the biggest things people underestimate is how much maturity evens out by the late teens. At 8, a 1 or 2 year old gap is massive. Emotionally, socially, physically, it's night and day. At 16 or 18, that gap barely registers. People catch up fast once puberty, responsibility, and real consequences enter the picture. The kid who was behind early suddenly starts thinking clearer, regulating emotions better, holding conversations more confidently, and it often surprises adults who mentally lock them into an early label. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Adults remember early impressions longer than kids deserve. Another thing that gets oversimplified is social confidence. It's easy to assume that if a kid is older, bigger, or more mature early on, they'll automatically be better socially forever. More confident, better with relationships, more attractive, active, more successful. But social confidence isn't a stat that you lock into early. It's situational. It changes based on environment, peers, stress, and experience. A kid can be confident when they're the biggest fish in the small pond, and then suddenly unsure when they're not. Another kid can struggle socially early, then thrive once they find a group, a skill, or a context that fits them better. Confidence built on comfort zones doesn't always survive new ones. What really shapes people long term isn't just being ahead, it's learning how to handle being behind, confused, challenged, or average without collapsing. And that's where predictions get tricky. Kids catch up in ways parents can't see coming. Some kids bloom late physically, some emotionally, some socially, some academically. Some don't show anything special until they find the right environment. Not the easiest ones, not the most favorable ones, just the right ones. There are kids who struggle quietly for years and then suddenly accelerate once things click. There are kids who coast early and stall when effort finally matters. None of that is predictable from second or third grade. It's not a failure of parenting, it's just reality. Another thing people don't like admitting, what works at 8 doesn't always matter at 28. No one in adulthood is sorting people by who was the oldest in their class. No one cares who hit puberty first, who was taller at 10, or who had an early confidence boost. What matters later is adaptability. Can you enter a new room and figure it out? Can you rebuild confidence when rules change? Can you learn when you're not automatically good at something? Those skills don't come from being ahead forever. They come from navigating different positions over time. This is where a lot of early advantage thinking quietly breaks down. If a kid's identity becomes, I'm ahead, what happens when they're not? If confidence is tied to comparison instead of competence, it gets fragile. If success is framed as dominance instead of resilience, it doesn't age well. That doesn't mean giving kids advantages is wrong. Parents do that naturally. It means no single advantage does as much work as people hope it will. And it definitely doesn't mean parents who follow rules are blind sabotaging their kids. Most kids succeed or struggle for reasons that have very little to do with grade placement and a lot to do with support, curiosity, emotional safety, and exposure to challenges they can recover from. You can give two kids the same advantage and get completely different outcomes because kids aren't strategies, they're people. They respond differently, they grow differently, they surprise you. And maybe the most grounding thing is remembering this. Life keeps resetting the game. New school, new cities, new jobs, new social circles, new expectations. Early reset wipes out a chunk of whatever advantage you thought was permanent. The people who do well across resets aren't the ones who were always ahead. They're the ones who learned how to adjust when they weren't. So when you zoom out, the question stops being, is holding a kid back smart or dumb? The better question is, what experience helps a kid feel capable no matter where they land? Because early advantages fade, maturity evens out, confidence shifts, and success long term has a lot more to do with flexibility than position. And that's not a warning, it's actually kind of relieving. It means there's more than one way to grow up okay. Alright, let's flip the perspective so we get a full 360 here. One thing that gets lost in these conversations is that struggle isn't automatically a disadvantage. In a lot of cases, it's actually where confidence starts forming. Just not the loud, obvious type. When a kid has to work a little hard to keep up, to speak up, to find their place, they're constantly practicing something most people don't notice. Self-trust. They're learning, I can figure this out even when it's uncomfortable. That's a different kind of confidence than the kind that comes from being ahead by default. It's quieter, less flashy, but it sticks. It keeps a kid learning. Being smaller, younger, or less dominant early on often forces kids to develop social awareness sooner. They can't rely on size or status, so they lean into reading people, adjusting tone, sensing dynamics. They learn when to push, when to pull back, when to joke, when to listen. That's not weakness, that's calibration. A lot of socially skilled adults weren't the biggest or the most dominant kids. They were the ones who had to navigate rooms instead of controlling them. And that skill carries from beyond school. There's also something important about not always being comfortable. Early comfort can feel like safety, but it can quietly delay growth. When things come easily, you don't have to experiment, adapt, or stretch. You just stay where you are and let the environment do the work for you. Adaptability, on the other hand, comes from friction, from having to adjust when you're not the obvious choice, from trying, failing, recalibrating, and trying again. The process builds a kind of internal flexibility that shows up later in friendships, careers, creative work, and leadership. Life doesn't reward people for being early forever. It rewards people who can handle change. That's why adaptability tends to beat early comfort over the long run. Another quiet thing that happens when you zoom out from age and look at competence, long-term confidence doesn't come from being older, bigger, or ahead. It comes from knowing you can do something well, solve problems, learn skills, communicate, recover from mistakes. Age-based confidence fades the moment the environment changes. Competence-based confidence travels with you. You can walk into a new room, a new job, a new social circle, and feel grounded because you've built real ability, not because you're supposed to be ahead, but because you've earned trust in yourself. That kind of confidence is hard to shake. And here's where timing gets overemphasized. People love debating when kids should start, advance, pause, or wait, but timing matters far less than guidance. Two kids can be the same age, in the same grade, with completely different outcomes based on what kind of support they're getting. Not pressure, not micromanagement, actual guidance. Someone helping back, someone reframing mistakes as feedback instead of failure, someone modeling emotional regulation, curiosity, and resilience. That does more for a kid's future than almost any structural advantage, because guidance teaches kids how to think, not just how to perform. There's also subtle risk in framing success as something you engineer early and then coast on. That mindset can turn growth into a fragile thing. If confidence depends on always being ahead, it doesn't handle disruption well, and disruption is guaranteed. New teachers, new peer groups, new cities, new expectations, new versions of yourself. Kids who have learned how to adapt, recalibrate, and build competence from scratch tend to handle those resets better than kids who were protected from them. That doesn't mean struggle should be forced or romanticized. It just means it isn't inherently harmful. Struggle with support is different from struggle alone. And finally, it helps to remember that success isn't linear and it isn't uniform. Some people peak early, some bloom late, some zigzag, some disappear for years and then reappear stronger than before. None of that is predictable from where someone sits in elementary school. When you flip the perspective, the question shifts. It's no longer how do we make sure our kids are ahead? How do we make sure our kid is ahead right now? It becomes how do we help our kid trust themselves when they're not? Because that's a skill that actually helps them out in the future. So in short, confidence built through navigation lasts longer than confidence built through position. Adaptability outlives early comfort. Competence outgrows age, and guidance shapes outcomes more than timing ever could. If you're still here, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, but let's go even deeper than that. What makes this tweet interesting isn't just the parenting angle, it's how familiar the thinking feels, especially if you've been an adult for more than 5 minutes, because we do this too. Maybe not with school enrollment, but with careers, relationships, money, fitness, social life. We're consistently always trying to win against the system. Just start a little faster, wait for better conditions, get more credentials, one more sign, one more advantage before we step in. It feels reasonable. It feels reasonable, strategic, smart. But a lot of the time, it's just a more polished way of avoiding discomfort. We delay things so we can feel ahead instead of exposed. We want to enter situations when we're confident we'll perform well, not when we're unsure. So we wait, we prepare, we tweak the plan, we optimize, and then we call that preparation. But preparation and control gets confused really fast. Control feels calming because it reduces uncertainty. If you can choose the timing, the conditions, the environment, you feel safe. You feel like you've been intentional instead of reactive. The problem is that life rarely rewards perfect timing. It rewards responsiveness. The skills that actually move things forward, confidence, communication, judgment, resilience, don't come from controlled environments. They come from situations where you don't fully know what you're doing yet. That's true for kids. It's even more true for adults. Think about how adults over-optimize the early game. People spend years planning a career move they never make, or researching a business idea until the market changes, or working on themselves so thoroughly that they never actually test themselves. It's not laziness. You fear that the plans you planned out aren't going to work, so you don't even try it. We think if we can just enter at the right moment, we'll avoid embarrassment, rejection, or failure. We'll skip the awkward phase, we'll protect our confidence. But confidence doesn't grow by being protected. It grows by being tested and surviving. That's the part that's easy to forget when you're trying to be smart. Another pattern is how we delay discomfort to maintain the feeling of being ahead. As long as you're preparing, you haven't failed yet. As long as you haven't started, you can still imagine yourself succeeding. That imagined success can feel better than real messy progress. So you stay in this loop, you're going to do it, never do it. You don't apply yet, you don't post yet, you don't ask yet, you don't commit yet, and that delay quietly becomes a habit. What's dangerous isn't the delay itself, it's the story you're telling yourself while you're delaying. That's just you trying to avoid unnecessary struggle, that others are rushing while you're thinking long term. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's just bullshit, man. It's just you overthinking this. Another overlooked thing is how much learning happens under pressure. Not extreme pressure, not trauma, but mild, consistent exposure to situations where you have to figure things out in the real time. Pressure forces prioritization. It sharpens attention. It makes feedback unavoidable. When you remove pressure entirely in the name of optimization, you also remove information. You don't find out what you're bad at. You don't discover your blind spots. You don't develop judgment. That's why people who've struggled early in one area often develop strength in others. They learn to compensate, to adjust, to read situations better. Those skills don't show up on a resume, but they matter. And here's the uncomfortable part. As adults, we often know this, but still avoid it. We want growth without friction, progress without vulnerability. vulnerability, confidence without exposure. So we try to engineer life the way this tweet tries to engineer childhood. Adjust the timing, control the conditions, and hope the outcome follows. Sometimes that works, but long term, the people who do best usually aren't the ones who had the cleanest start. They're the ones who learned how to operate when things weren't ideal. They learned how to adapt, recover, recalibrate, and keep moving. When you connect the dots, this isn't really about holding kids back or pushing them forward. It's about a relationship with discomfort, whether we see it as something to eliminate or something to work with. And if you're an adult watching this, that's probably the real question worth sitting on. Where are you over optimizing in this game of life? Where are you confusing control with preparation? Where are you waiting to feel ahead instead of willing to feel exposed? Because those patterns don't disappear with age. If anything, they get better at hiding. And once you notice that, the conversation changes. Not about parenting choices, but about how we all approach growth when there's something on the line. So let's figure this out. Is this tweet worth putting in the bank, or should you just throw this in the trash? I would definitely say throw this in the trash. It really has no meaning. It doesn't serve you any purpose. And this is the type of shit that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And if you need any help with life plans or a way to get over a certain situation and you want to talk it out or something, fill out the form up above and we'll talk soon.